You know, there's one thing that I can say about Fortnite that's done really well is that every chapter, there's some new mechanic that's added that completely changes the way that we play the game. Think back to the start of every new chapter that we've had. Chapter 2 not only introduced swimming and fishing, but it also added wildlife into the ecosystem. This just made the game feel more alive in a way that it never did before. Not to mention, this is also the season that added NPCs, and for better or for worse, it was definitely a quality of life change that just kind of transformed the way that we played Fortnite. Chapter 3 was all about movement, sliding, mantling, vaulting, sprinting, and of course the ever controversial zero builds. Then you move on to Chapter 4, and the big main feature that was added were the augments. It switched up the gameplay formula in a way that we've never seen before. Now, when you look at Chapter 5, what are the two things that were added this chapter that just don't really seem to hit? Number one would be wall climbing, which, okay, it's cool, and it does have its utility in builds. I don't have a problem with it. Is it as exciting as the other changes to movement? No, but it's not that bad. But then you look at the other thing we got, which is weapon attachments. When you start to analyze that, you really realize how big of a disappointment it was. Now, this is not the first time I brought up weapon attachments on this channel. However, this is the first time I've had a dedicated video just to this topic. I think the lack of investment in weapon attachments this chapter is probably the biggest failing of Chapter 5 as a whole. You're talking about a battle royale shooting game. At its core, the gunplay must feel satisfying, and I think weapon attachments were a good idea, just poorly executed. My boy Jojo Zai just made a funny video about how Fortnite has commitment issues, and one of the points he brought up was how Fortnite had a problem committing to weapon attachments. The last time we got any new weapon mods added to this game was back in Season 2. There was even a tweet a while back that teased different weapon attachments that were going to completely change the way we played the game, but they never came. And it begs the question as to why. Why did Fortnite drop the ball when it came to weapon attachments? If I'm being transparent with you guys, I don't really have an answer to that question today. I don't really know why Epic Games would want to drop weapon attachments, but instead what I want to look at is why they aren't successful and why they don't feel rewarding. One of the first things that comes to my mind when I'm comparing weapon attachments to all the other new features that we got added in each other chapter, there's one major issue that they have, and this is something I've talked about briefly on the channel before. The first and arguably the biggest problem with weapon mods compared to every other new feature that we've ever had added to Fortnite is that it is very difficult to interact with. Once again, Fortnite is known for adding a new key feature, a new game-changing mechanic that it wants its player base to interact with. That's kind of the theme for a chapter. And for the first time in Fortnite history, they made it incredibly difficult to do that. Why is it that the main feature of the chapter that's fundamental to how gunplay works is so difficult to interact with? You make mod benches so few and far between. Season 1 was the only time where mod benches were decently accessible because you could go to them at any point in time as long as the vault was open. But every season since then, ever since these bunkers have been introduced, it's been far more difficult to find a mod bench to interact with. Can you imagine for a moment back in Chapter 2 if they had treated side grade benches the same way? Something like mod benches should be available at every single POI on the map. There should not be a single hot drop that I land at where I can't upgrade my weapon. It's so weird because right now they're only accessible in random bunkers on the map, and those bunkers are only open during late game scenarios. It's almost like Epic Games is afraid for you to be able to upgrade these weapons consistently. Like they don't want you to customize and modify your guns anytime you want. And see, here's the thing. This wouldn't be as much of an issue if the mods weren't instrumental for the weapons feeling decent to use, which is actually my second issue with weapon attachments. In one of my previous videos, I went into a bit of detail about hit scan versus bullet drop, and one of the things that I mentioned was that hit scan weapons just feel better. And now, after doing some thinking, I think I understand why that is. See, it's not so much that these new weapons feel bad, because I have had some fights where these weapons do feel good and I hit a lot of shots, but the problem is they don't feel consistent. See, the difference between the old weapons and the new weapons is that anytime I picked up a SCAR or a Hammer AR or just any one of the old guns, I knew exactly what it felt like. There might be a slight difference in bloom and damage because of the rarity, but generally speaking, I knew how the feel and the flow of that gun worked. When it comes to the new weapons, it's not like that. Depending on what attachments you have, it's going to give you a completely different experience with that weapon. And once again, I think that that's cool, but the problem is you don't give me enough ways to interact with it and customize the gun the way I want it to be. But let's put that issue to the side for a moment. The other half of this is that if I pick up a weapon that doesn't have any attachments on it whatsoever, it is a pain in the butt to use. It is objectively better to use a gun with weapon attachments than it is one without. That's the whole point of the entire chapter. That's why you need weapon attachments. I get that, that's fine. But the problem is a baseline AR just feels terrible to use. Without a scope on it, a lot of these guns just don't don't feel like they're worth using. Even when it comes to close-range weapons like shotguns, the attachments make such a big difference. There are literally attachments in the game that are designed for you to be able to hit shots more accurately by hip firing. Those are the attachments that you typically put on your SMGs and your ARs because at close range, you're not trying to ADS. And ironically, even though you can put a scope on shotguns, I would argue that the vast majority of good players are not ADSing when they're using shotguns. But the problem is shotgun usage can feel completely inconsistent because I don't always have the same attachments on the shotgun, and I also don't have the ability to upgrade it when I need to. So basically, I have to hope that I can find a shotgun with the right attachments on it and use it the way I want to be able to use it. And if not, I have to use a different version of the same gun that I'm trying to get good with, which also makes it confusing when you're just trying to be consistent. Getting good at something means you need consistency. It means you need repetition. And unfortunately, with weapon mods, you can't guarantee that. Here's my final point to this issue. I think that if weapon mods were more easily accessible, if people could use them more frequently and more consistently, I think less people would actually have an issue with bullet drop. Bullet drop is easier to mitigate when you have the right attachments on to compensate for the recoil. But when you don't have those attachments, it's far harder to control the spray on your weapon. Doesn't mean that it's completely unmanageable. However, it just makes the gun far more difficult to use, unnecessarily difficult, I would argue. The play pattern for the game this chapter should have been people landing and trying to find the right attachments for their weapons at the start of every round. That way they could use the gun the way that they wanted to off the jump. Or at the very least be able to access a mod bench to where even if they didn't have the right attachments, they could customize the gun in a way that felt a little bit more unique, or at least playable to their standards. But with that statement, I'm getting a little ahead of myself because that implies that not all attachments are always available at every mod bench. And that goes to my third issue that I have with them right now. The way that mods work in Fortnite doesn't really feel like it has a Fortnite twist to it. But what do I mean by that? Listen, I haven't been one of the people that's been complaining about how Fortnite has been taking itself too seriously this entire chapter. However, there is a certain level of seriousness that's been brought in that I don't feel like really fits with the branding of Fortnite. Like, weapon mods are fine and attachments are cool, but I don't feel like they've been executed in a way that feels like Fortnite. I have to agree with people that it feels like a more watered down version of Call of Duty than it does Fortnite when I'm putting on weapon attachments. The attachment system isn't really that complex or well thought out. First off, I think it would have been better to have weapon attachments as ground loot. Like, you had to find weapon attachments in the wild, and weapon attachments also could have had different rarities. Second of all, I think it would have been interesting for certain weapon attachments to have certain abilities associated with them. For example, last chapter we had exotic weapons that gave us different powers, like 0-point dash, or maybe give you the ability to move faster. Why don't we have weapon attachments that do that? Like, I should be able to put a silencer on my Scar, and that gives me the ability to 0-point dash, or it gives me the ability to move faster, or maybe it even gives me a nitro effect if I'm playing the nitro season. Just some kind of attachment that makes it more customizable or more fun, or makes the gameplay experience a bit more unique. A more versatile, in-depth gameplay style could have been incorporated here, and it's just such a big missed opportunity in my mind. Here's another thing that I think would have been really cool for attachments. Since we decided to leave augments out this chapter, which fine, whatever, we don't have to have augments, why don't you give the attachments the abilities of the augments? For example, maybe there's an attachment that gives me Siphon, or gives me Bush Warrior, or maybe even another one that gives me the Slap Juice effect. Something that makes the gameplay feel more like Fortnite. It aligns more with Fortnite's identity. It plays in a way that's goofy, but feels really cool and rewarding when you use it. Also, when you have a playstyle that works like this, the ultimate goal is not to just make the best weapon you can, but to create a playstyle that fits well with how you like to play Fortnite. Not only would it make the gameplay feel far more dynamic, but it would make it feel more rewarding, because now I'm not only just using really good gun pieces to make my gun more accurate, but now I'm also having different powers associated with my weapon type or my play style. Also, if we're working off a system that allows you to keep weapon attachments in your inventory, the utility of the mod badges would have been for you to upgrade the gun and maybe change its rarity, or maybe you could have swapped out guns that you had. For example, if I have 2 Scars in my inventory, but one of them is gray and another one is blue, instead of having me completely pay for new attachments, I just swap the gun out that I'm putting the attachments on. In my opinion, the way that it works right now is too clunky. I don't like the fact that if I find a new version of the same gun that I have that's better, instead of just being able to swap the gun out, I have to swap all the attachments out and pay all that gold just to get new attachments on the same gun, but just more accurate or more powerful. The funny thing is, in many ways, this poor UI design is a reflection reflection of the poor UI design that Fortnite has for the lobby and the locker and all that right now. And look, there's not a video to break all that down, but you can kind of see a pattern here. I just don't think that this system was very well thought out, and it was not optimized for the most fun gameplay. Fortnite has done similar concepts in the past, but the way that this was executed was just so lackluster compared to previous seasons. I like the way that side grading used to work back in Chapter 2. I even like the crafting system that we had during that time period. If Epic just had taken the DNA from that, but extrapolated it and expanded it into something a bit more profound, a bit more diverse, like I said, maybe incorporating the augment system or the exotic system, and just put that in weapon attachments, every game would have felt so much more fun and so much more dynamic. This is one of the main reasons why I'm looking forward to OG Chapter 2. Like, I missed the side grading system. It was very simple, yet very effective. It was very efficient. And I just think that Fortnite overcomplicated things this chapter. Now, simplicity doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better. Like, the system that I'm proposing is definitely far more complex than what we have now, but it also feels rewarding. And one of the reasons why it feels rewarding is because you have specific items that exist only in specific rarities. That's another big failing of modern Fortnite ever since Chapter 3, and I've said this a million times, but having every weapon exist at every rarity destroys the fun of being able to pick up certain guns. At the very least, if we had included the mod bench system that I'm proposing, it would have made gunplay and collecting these items feel far more rewarding. The gun would have been your base, but the weapon attachments is what would have made all the difference in gameplay and how you moved around the map in terms of how you engaged fights. And that, I feel like, is what Fortnite players are really looking for. Here's hoping that we get some kind of fix for this in Chapter 6. I don't necessarily think that bullet drop and weapon attachments need to go away, but they need a complete rework. And if Fortnite's gonna do better in Chapter 6, the gunplay, the attachments, that needs to be the foundation of whatever it is that Epic Games decides to do moving forward into the next chapter.